there's this judicial fight that we're seeing with U.S. v. Scarmetti hitting the Supreme Court last week. This case is really considered the most consequential case to specifically target trans folks. What's frightening about this case is that we know it's coming at a time when there is this ultra conservative majority on the Supreme Court, and we've already seen the rollbacks on so many landmark decisions. Radical defiance is something that we have to do in the face of fascism, in the face of authoritarianism, in the face of ultranationalism, and we have to be willing to call it that.
Welcome to episode 229 of the Refuse Fascism podcast, a podcast brought to you by volunteers with Refuse Fascism. I'm Sam Goldman, one of those volunteers and host of the show. Refuse Fascism exposes, analyzes, and stands against the very real danger and threat of fascism coming to power in the United States. In today's episode, we're sharing two interviews. First, you'll hear from journalist, activist, and author Raquel Willis, co-founder of the Gender Liberation Movement. Then you'll hear from Philly-based street artist Yomi. To begin with, though, I want to thank our patrons and sustainers who make this show possible, everyone who rates and reviews the show on Apple or their listening platform of choice. They boost the show so much, so please do so after listening to this episode. Thanks to those who share the show, everyone who buys our merch to support and spread the show. We have a new design thanks to Susan, a volunteer who made a new design in black ink and white ink. Both are available with our slogan, "In the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America." It's available in hoodies and sweatshirts for those of us in cold climates and t-shirts for everyone else. See the show notes to get yours. Wanted to share just a couple comments that we got off of last week's episode. Roberto Martinez on YouTube wrote, "These are moral orders. I was in Fort Hood, Texas in 1968. We were ordered to go to Chicago after Dr. Martin Luther King was murdered. I refused to go along with my other Vietnam veterans." Thanks for sharing, Roberto, and it's so great to hear that. And at Jen Wendy 7 commented, "God, these are terrifying times, absolutely unreal." And we completely agree, Jen Wendy, and yet these are really things that are happening and things that we really need to resist with everything we've got. And the last comment that we want to share is Pete Schumacher 3647 over again on the YouTubes. Commented, "One concern I have is that the Trump MAGA forces will create, quote unquote, volunteers for national security, Italy, black shirts, as a backup and mobilization tool for mass deportations and other repression. They probably also want to change the ethnic and ideological composition of the military fairly quickly." Thanks, Pete, for your input and engagement with that episode. If you have not listened to last week's episodes, go do so after listening to this one. This giving season, please make a gift to Refuse Fascism. With Trump's inauguration just weeks away, now is the time to turn your anger and anguish into action. Whether you can give $2 a month or $25 a month, a one-time gift of $5 or $50, it all makes a difference. In contrast to the popular beliefs that we survived this before by focusing on me and mine, and the Democratic Party platform of accommodation, Refuse Fascism confronts this fascist danger head on and leads people to reject MAGA fascism. We refuse to normalize mass deportations, to make peace with campaigns of terror, or to adjust to a Christian theocracy that endangers the lives and freedom of women and LGBTQ people. You can count on us to connect you with a community of hundreds of experts and activists from a variety of backgrounds and perspectives who expose the reality and roots of this modern-day American fascism and determination to act on that commitment in the name of humanity. We refuse to accept a fascist America. The podcast inspires efforts to confront and defeat the threat, and we hope that we can count on your help to not just keep the show going, but drastically increase its reach and impact. As you know, we are 100% funded by people who share the urgent understanding that we are the ones we've been waiting for and the time to act is now. Please join our Patreon community. You can gift a membership at patreon.com/refusefascism/gift or make a one-time end-of-year gift today to enable us to educate broadly, to defend people under attack, to challenge and mobilize the decent people. Visit refusefascism.org and hit the donate button or Venmo refuse-fascism or Cash App Refuse Fascism. Thank you for your support. Now onward with a little recap of the fascist DEFCON level, and I'll share some of what's needed from those who do not want a fascist USA. This past Saturday, J.D. Vance and Donald Trump attended the annual Army-Navy football game. Vance brought along Daniel Penny as his guest. If that name isn't familiar to you, Penny, a white ex-Marine, murdered Jordan Neely, an unarmed homeless man in a New York City subway car. Bringing him was part of celebrating Penny's acquittal of all charges, his walking free for the modern-day lynching of Jordan Neely. He has been celebrated by the fascist movement as a model of masculinity, using the extensive deadly training he received as a Marine and brute strength to crush the throat of a defenseless, deprived, seemingly hopeless man living on the street. He did this for a full 6 minutes. Penny's combat instructor made clear that Penny must have known that the force he used was both extremely deadly and wholly unnecessary. But for Vance's part, this celebration and admiration of vile white murderers is not new, and is a tactic that corrodes our collective humanity more and more each time it is used. In 2020, Vance championed Kyle Rittenhouse. In that same year, the RNC featured Mark and Patricia McCloskey, praised for threatening peaceful protesters with automatic weapons. Texas Governor Greg Abbott recently pardoned Daniel Perry, who murdered Garrett Foster at a BLM protest in Texas. In 2019, Trump intervened in the trial of war criminal Eddie Gallagher, whose cruelty was derided by his own elite commando unit. He subsequently pardoned and publicly congratulated him. Meanwhile, Trump himself went on a killing spree at the end of his first term, executing, quote, more people than any administration in 120 years and more than the 10 previous administrations combined, end quote, as reported by the ACLU. He's promised to kill every person currently on death row, greatly expand the use of the death penalty against drug dealers, quote unquote, shoplifters, and his political enemies. And through celebrating Penny, they are making clear that any racist white man has been deputized to carry out that sentence on the flimsiest of pretexts or for no reason at all. During Trump's interview last Sunday with Meet the Press, which normalized and platformed his fascist program in a similar fashion to the way that Time magazine did by making him Person of the Year, Trump used this opportunity to affirm his intent to seal the U.S.-Mexico border and deport millions of undocumented people through a mass deportation program, making clear his intent that U.S. citizens would be included in his quote-unquote send them all back effort. He declared that he'd use executive action to end birthright citizenship, under which people born in the U.S. are considered citizens, actively ignoring that such protections are spelled out in the Constitution. When challenged about family separation and deporting children who were born in this country, he echoed his border czar, Tom Homan, stating, quote, so the only way you don't break up the family is you keep them together and you have to send them all back, end quote. And as for public outcry about the devastation and terror he promises, of course the fascist policy wasn't to blame, but the media, for covering what the reality looks like. In our ongoing segment, A Shock to Nobody, Trump has now gotten official support from the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association, announcing, quote, its full support for the proposed deportation initiatives outlined by former President Donald Trump and former ICE Director Tom Homan. The plan aims to address the issue of individuals residing in the United States unlawfully and emphasizes the critical role of sheriffs in ensuring effective implementation, end quote. The Republican Governors Association has pledged total support for Trump's mass deportation plans, stating, quote, We stand ready to utilize every tool at our disposal, whether through state law enforcement or the National Guard, to support President Trump in this vital mission, end quote. And militias on the U.S.-Mexico border have also offered their involvement. Many of these militias have patrolled, aka terrorized immigrants on the border for decades now with tacit consent from local authorities and Border Patrol. They feel confident that they will receive the green light to expand their efforts. Here is Tom Homan on Fox speaking glowingly of these militias.
Thousands of retired agents, retired border patrol agents, retired military that want to come in and volunteer to help this president secure the border and do the deportation operation.
And what may be a surprise to some who don't regularly listen to our show, Trump's also gotten cooperation and commitment of compromise from the Democratic Party, whose approach on immigration is summed up well by Governor Phil Murphy of New Jersey, who promised to, quote, fight like hell to find common ground, end quote. As Homan tells Democrats,
and look, I've seen some of these Democratic governors say they're going to stand in the way. They're going to make it hard for us. Well, a suggestion: if you're not going to help us, get the hell out of the way, because we're going to do it.
Largely, the response from Democratic governors, as described by a recent New York Times article, is, quote, some defiance toward the president-elect's expected crackdown, but also a surprising willingness to work with him, end quote, with the exception of some Democratic senators pressuring Biden to extend temporary protections for legally present migrants, DACA and TPS recipients. As we said a couple weeks ago, this is because both the Democrats and Republicans represent the system that breeds this fascism. The Democrats' whole reason for being is to try to stabilize a system which destroys oppressed countries around the globe, which requires a permanent underclass of super exploitable workers, and which decides the fates of billions of human beings based simply on which imaginary lines they were born between. We encourage folks to find and join protests that are happening on International Migrants Day, which takes place December 18th, to defend and support immigrant rights. Meanwhile, the state of Texas has sued Dr. Margaret Carpenter over providing abortion pills to a woman in Texas. This is the first instance of a tactic long promised by the Christian fascist movement to enforce their bans on abortion, to, as Jessica Valenti puts it, to punish the helpers. Dr. Carpenter, the founder of the Abortion Coalition for Telemedicine, is ostensibly protected by New York's SHIELD law, which means that New York will not cooperate with any other state's effort to prosecute or penalize a doctor for providing abortion pills, as long as the doctor complies with New York law. But it's unclear if the law would protect Carpenter from having to pay the whatever exorbitant penalties Texas imposes. With this action, the state government of Texas is issuing a very clear threat to every doctor in the nation with an ounce of integrity, a threat to the sovereignty of other state governments, and compounding the already deadly threat against women and anyone who might ever need an abortion across the state of Texas. It is estimated that SHIELD laws like New York's currently enable abortion access to almost 10,000 people across the country every single month. This will be the first legal test in a process that will likely lead to the fascist-stacked Supreme Court. Even simply filing this lawsuit will likely have a chilling effect on doctors' willingness to provide this essential service across state lines. But it's clear that the fascists who run Texas are out for blood. And with the Supreme Court and the next administration solidly in their corner, this legal fight just might become an explosive flashpoint in the fascist consolidation of power nationwide. We'll be following this case as it develops. In the meantime, see Jessica Valenti's coverage in the show notes. Now is not a time to be doubling down on band-aids and stopgaps that remain on the defense of this Christian fascist offensive against women. Now is a time to be looking at the roots of this fascism and take the offensive against it as we defend the rights and lives of people who come under attack. As Texas is terrorizing doctors and killing women through denying them life-saving reproductive health care, South Carolina GOP wants to actively kill women for receiving abortion care. Not one, not two, but 8 Republican state representatives are sponsoring a bill that would supersede the state's current 6-week abortion ban and put obtaining an abortion on par with homicide, punishable by death. For anyone taken in by Christian fascist self-proclaimed concern for women, this should be a wake-up call. Even as this is currently confined to one state legislature now, the notion of fetal personhood under the law which underpins this bill is the stated goal of many Christian fascist preachers and politicians, is officially endorsed by the Texas GOP's party platform, and was given credence in the Supreme Court's Dobbs decision, overturning the federal right to abortion. Even if they have not yet made this deadly, delusional legal doctrine into law. Even as the complicit media paint a picture of Trump being indecisive or moderate on abortion, Trump has famously said that women should face some form of punishment for abortions, and he is responsible for the judges that strip the right to abortion from tens of millions of people. This is where we're at, going into Trump's second term. Where will we be if we allow him to consolidate power? This outrage isn't front page news, it's atrocity on top of atrocity. And this modern day stoning of women bill is yet another urgent reason we must, yes, defend those who seek abortions and those that provide them and help secure them, but also go forward with the fight on a whole other level for legal abortion on demand and without apology, defeating these women-hating, Bible-thumping, fetal tissue-worshipping fascists. As I said with the other story, we will continue to cover it, and in the meantime, direct you to coverage by Jessica Valenti. Today, I want to limit my updates on the Trump Revengers cabinet to one recent nomination. Trump has nominated Harmeet Dhillon to serve as the Department of Justice's Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. This position is in charge of protecting voting rights and enforcing federal laws that protect individuals from discrimination. So obviously, her qualifications are being opposed to civil rights, an enemy to voting rights, especially for Black folks, and using her law degree as a bludgeon for discrimination, especially against LGBTQ plus people. Her fascist credentials include being a leading legal figure in the work to roll back voting rights across the country, defending Trump against the various state efforts to have him removed from the ballot for violating Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, supporting Trump's quest to overturn results in 2020, serving as a legal advisor on his presidential campaign and co-chair of the For Lawyers for Trump coalition, and vehemently anti-LGBTQ track record. The stakes of this appointment were made clear by journalist and trans rights activist Erin, who wrote, quote, "With the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division at her disposal, Dhillon's appointment signals an alarming shift that could make life increasingly difficult for transgender people nationwide, including those who have sought refuge in blue states to escape anti-trans legislation," end quote. If the current attack on trans rights was the only bad thing the Republicans were doing, it would need to be resisted tooth and nail. But in the real world, this anti-trans campaign is an integral part of a fascist agenda on the cusp of power. How does this fit into the puzzle? Well, fascism always roots itself in the prejudices and oppressive social relations that go unspoken in capitalist societies. In recent decades, the fascists have coalesced around defining real America, around restricting and denying rights to anyone they deem as some subhuman or un-American. People of color, immigrants, those women at the beginning of every Hallmark movie, and more. But it is not only about exclusion. It is also about violently reasserting outmoded and oppressive social roles within their white Christian utopia, roles designed and set in stone by their controlling and vengeful God. In the same period that this nightmare vision has been uniting tens of millions, trans folks have won expansions of their rights and much more broader acceptance in society. To the fascists, this is unacceptable. At the heart of this cruelty is the fact that changes in the quote-unquote nuclear family, which have been brought about by larger changes in the economy and society, and this growing awareness, acceptance, and prevalence among sections of people, especially young people, of gender expansive folks, are challenging and in some ways undermining traditional patriarchal relations and authority. The authority of men that has been fundamental to holding U.S. society together on, let's be clear, a highly oppressive basis. The fascist agenda is in large part about reasserting in the most grotesque and violent forms of what they believe made America great. white supremacy, male supremacy, and good old American chauvinism. These fascists see the changes, the gains made by women, LGBTQ plus people as an existential threat and are determined to reverse them through brute force. And sadly, all too many non-fascists, this progress remains negotiable, conditional, subject to the ebbs and flows of the market, the empire, and its so-called democracy. Even where these rights have been written into the law, the framework of those laws are still based in a 240-year-old document that guarantees rights to men. And they did only mean men, certain men at that. Even as various rights have been expanded through intense struggle, the legal framework built on this fundamentally oppressive foundation retains all the vestiges of worse days past, ready to be wielded by those who aim to aggressively roll back any progress. As truly horrific as the origins of this country were, genocidal attempts to violently reassert those conditions in a rapidly warming world with nuclear-armed empires determined to gain ever greater power or die trying, with billions already living in the most grinding poverty, this is poised to lead to unimaginable horrors. This is where we stand. This is what we have to fight to overcome. And I just got to put it directly to folks. Will those on the side of decency recognize the depth of the threat posed by these fascists and move not only to defend LGBTQ plus people against these attacks, but fight for a better future, for a whole different world? Well, that's up to us. The official opposition, however, the Democratic Party, is not going to call out these Christian fascists for what they are, and is determined to reinforce the very institutions that have gotten us into this mess. The Democratic Party exists to maintain a stable empire, and while many of them oppose the imposition of fascism, they are much more scared of a real fight against that fascism, with all the chaos that may bring, with the collective power of masses of people bursting open the confines of dead-end politics as usual, and with all the dreams for radical change such a struggle might inspire. The Democratic Party and the institutions of American democracy cannot save us. They can't even save the Democratic Party politicians themselves in the crosshairs of Trump's revenge. We simply can't beat them on their terms, playing their game. But that doesn't mean that we can't beat them. We need, as Raquel calls for in this interview, radical defiance. If we aren't going to succumb to their cruel and brutal future, we need people en masse, you, everyone you know and don't, to put our bodies, our whole beings on the line, to ask deeper questions about how we got here and how we get free, to go on the political offensive. We need to confront reality, and right now that means confronting head-on the reality of fascism ascending to power. So once more, this escalation and intensification of the attacks on transgender folks by Republifascist is just that, a fascist campaign, a truly horrific campaign that is extremely harmful, in fact, lethal to transgender people and also to society more broadly. And it needs to be met with massive refusal right fucking now. With that, here's my conversation with Raquel Willis. Last week, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments in U.S. v. Skermetti. The case is a challenge to Tennessee's trans healthcare ban for minors, and the hearing signaled the likely outcome of the court upholding such bans, barring important forms of gender-affirming care, endangering the lives and safety of trans people, emboldening patriarchal gender norms, and advancing the fascist agenda. This is the most significant challenge to trans rights to appear on the Supreme Court's docket, with the state of Tennessee arguing against the very humanity of trans people and against the conclusions of every major medical academy and organization in the country. To talk about this case, its implications, the larger attacks on trans rights and lives that this case is situated in, including the danger posed with Trump returning to the White House in just weeks, and the Democratic Party's cooperation with these fascists, I am so honored to speak with activist, author, and journalist Raquel Willis. She is co-founder of the Gender Liberation Movement, an executive producer with iHeartMedia's first ever LGBTQ plus podcast network, Outspoken. She is also the author of The Risk It Takes to Bloom on Life and Liberation. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me on.
I feel like before we talk about the Supreme Court case, it's important that we kind of ground ourselves in the larger anti-trans landscape that this case sits in. And I was hoping that you could give our listeners a sense of some of the onslaught that this is a part of. People might hear about bills here and a bill there, but kind of full scope of what's going on from not every case, but the situation, broadly speaking, facing folks.
So I am no legal expert, but I think just to back up, because a lot of people don't really get how we got to this point just in culture. We know in 2015, there was a ruling from the Supreme Court that essentially made marriage equality the law of the land, as we heard time and time again. The Republican Party saw that win around marriage equality as really earth-shattering in a lot of ways. It really crumbled up a lot of their arguments for at least the last few decades before that around how marriage equality and recognizing cisgender, gay, lesbian, bisexual, queer people would open the door to people being able to marry their pets and all of the kind of fear-mongering that was happening in that time. And so trans people became the next kind of boogeyman, and I should probably say boogie person, for the Republican Party. With that, we started to see, of course, an increase in anti-trans bills and legislation across the country. One of the first major fights was HB 2 in North Carolina, essentially the bathroom bills that really started to kick off this moment where they were testing what could work, what could stick to attack the trans community. At that time, it didn't stick. People thought it was ridiculous. There were a lot of companies that came out against that effort. There was a lot of political pushback, particularly from the Democratic Party. And so we saw what the reaction should have been. It should have been a very full-throated, robust rejection of this bigotry, what I'm now calling bathroom bigotry. Now, all around this happening was, of course, the increase of visibility of the LGBTQ plus community writ large, but also of transgender people. We saw that with the phenomenal Laverne Cox getting that legendary role on Orange is the New Black in 2013. Then we started to see more and more of these kind of cultural touchstone moments for the trans community. You can talk about Caitlyn Jenner, who has become a tool of all that is against the community right now, but her kind of coming out on a national stage played a role in that visibility era. And I think Republicans saw that and were frightened by it, but also saw maybe in a prescient way, okay, well, maybe down the road, there can be some kind of backlash that we can stoke towards this sliver of the U.S. population. And right now, that is kind of what we're in. And I like to liken it to the kind of backlash that we're also seeing against, for instance, the movement for Black Lives and all of the strides there, the backlash we're seeing against women and other folks of marginalized gender when we think about the impact of Me Too and on and on. It's all kind of coming under this umbrella of a backlash to wokeism, or as our new co-president-elect Elon Musk calls the woke mind virus. All of that has been happening. And I think for the average cisgender American, it's like, okay, why am I hearing about this all the time? Why do these people matter? It must be their fault that I'm hearing about trans people all the time. And also they must be deserving of these political attacks in some way. Like, I think some Americans feel that we've brought it onto ourselves, but that is not true. So I wanted to give kind of that breakdown that there's obviously this judicial fight that we're seeing with U.S. v. Scarametti hitting the Supreme Court last week with the arguments being made in part by Chase Strangio, who became the first openly trans person to argue a case in front of the Supreme Court. But there's also just been this kind of cultural backlash brewing alongside the legislative backlash for the last decade plus.
I appreciate you pulling back the lens and talking about the culture shift that occurred that is happening alongside these acts of legislation that have every year, it's like a new record is broken in terms of how much anti-trans bullshit has gone through. And for people who haven't been following it, it is quite...
It's a crash course.
Yeah, it's really stunning in a certain way how many aspects of people's lives, what I call the Republic fascists, have gone after in terms of going after healthcare, education, yes, bathrooms, the legal recognition, basically anything that has to do with the right to publicly exist. I think it's something that, while I understand that people might rationalize it's such a small percentage of the population is what they like to say or something like that. And it's like, yes, and consider how vicious people can be going after a population.
And you know what's so interesting about that? I mean, just to add, and of course you know this because there's no way to talk about fascism without talking about Nazi Germany, but obviously the figures are not exactly the same, but the Jewish population of Germany, at least at the start of this Nazi era, was around 1%. If that. So, I think this idea of it's a sliver of a population ignores that also actually makes it easier to turn massive groups of folks against the population. I want people to be thinking about that, right? Like, it's convenient to turn the everyday person against trans people right now, because beyond all of that that's happening, we also just exist in a society where there have never been an expansive way of talking about identity or gender specifically. And folks are unsettled by the idea that these very rigid norms that maybe they grew up with and were indoctrinated with are being called out as bullshit, because they are.
Really appreciate that reminder. I wanted to get your thoughts on US v. Scarametti, and if you could just share with us, what do you see as the significance of this case for trans rights?
Well, this case is really considered the first, or at least the most consequential case to specifically target trans folks and our lives and our experiences. Obviously, there was the Bostock case around employment discrimination, for instance, that we saw people arguing for a few years ago. But that was also tied to other cases that were about sexual orientation, for instance. So thinking about the wedding cake debacle, like, is it legal, constitutional to deny a same-sex couple or same-gender couple a birthday cake or whatever services if you don't agree with your business? So this one is specifically speaking to the trans experience. It's coming out of Tennessee. There are 3 families at the heart of it, with young trans people and a physician who also kind of is facing scrutiny in this case around access to gender-affirming care for young people. What's frightening about this case is that we know it's coming at a time when there is this ultra-conservative majority on the Supreme Court, and we've already seen the rollbacks on so many landmark decisions, thinking about voting rights, thinking about, of course, the Dobbs decision in Roe v. Wade, which really stripped protections for access to abortion and reproductive care. So this is scary that this case is in the hands of this Supreme Court that has consistently shown us that it is not on the side of folks who are at the margins of our society. I think also just pulling out of the case is this kind of discussion around access to healthcare and what is legitimate healthcare and which identities and experiences are legitimate. And I think for a lot of people, there's still this question of, whether trans people are who we say we are, whether you can really be a different gender than the sex or gender that you were assigned at birth. And I think in that is a discussion around whether gender affirming care is necessary and should be accessible. There's the age conversation, but I think there's also the threat that particularly this incoming Trump administration is going to push even further so that also adults won't be able to access gender affirming care. But the thing is, gender affirming care is necessary care like anybody else's healthcare. We're finally at a point where there's a vast majority of folks who understand that abortion care and being able to make your own decisions around pregnancy outcomes is necessary. That has not always been the case. I think with gender affirming care, because most people don't access what's often considered gender affirming care or don't believe that what they access is gender affirming care, they see our experiences as a choice and as something that people can live without. And the data is on our side that when you deny trans and non-binary folks access to gender affirming care, it has devastating impacts on people's mental health and often leads to suicidal ideation, and particularly for trans youth. One of the reasons that I am so outspoken is actually because of the death by suicide of two trans teens, one in December 2014, Leila Alcorn. So it's been 10 years now, like almost exactly. And a young Black trans boy, go figure, from North Carolina, where some of this bathroom bill hoopla came about a few years afterwards, named Blake Brockington, who made headlines for being the first openly trans homecoming royal in his state. They both died by suicide within months of each other. I believe it was December and February. It was largely because they didn't see a future for themselves as openly trans people. I get emotional about that because at that time, I had started my career in journalism and media, but I wasn't out at work, at least. I actually didn't have many possibility models in journalism who were out as trans. I came to know Janet Mock and other folks like her using their platforms to be authentic and vulnerable about our experiences. But I really didn't see a possibility to have employment being out. So I know what that felt like at the time. And I also knew that I was insulated enough, had privilege to take a risk, and that I needed to do that to at least be a part of shifting what's possible for young trans people. So it's real. You know, trans people are real. Our experiences are deeply felt and real. And trans youth are real. Yeah, many trans people don't have access to the language or affirmation for huge chunks of our lives. I think that it's both sad that that is the case, that there are many in our community who don't know themselves until they're fully in their adulthood. And also, I think there's a beauty in it because it means we have so many different prisms and lenses to look at transness. There was a time where the only trans people you would have access to stories from were folks who were elders. Like, I remember when I came out as trans around 21 years old in 2012, 2013, most of the stories that I had access to were trans people, particularly women who had lived very traditional cisgender male lives, had a whole family, had kids, and then had to figure out how to navigate their transition basically alongside their whole family. I didn't know many others who were my age, who were trans women. I knew a lot of trans masculine folks at that time. I share that to say that trans folks have always been here, and it's important that we protect, fight for, and defend young trans people.
I think that your experience is incredibly moving and inspiring. And I think that it's crushing to think of what it would mean, not just for the youth of Tennessee that could lose access to gender affirming care, what it means to the 26 other states that have these bans getting the thumbs up, but what it means for all of us to be considering that a whole section of society, their very lives don't matter just as much as yours. And I think that that is an incredibly, incredibly sad, awful place as a society to be in.
It is. And to your point, cisgender people access what's considered gender affirming care for trans people all the time. And also children, cisgender children. So if a child is not experiencing puberty in this kind of traditional way that we expect them to based on the sex they were assigned at birth, they will be prescribed hormones or even puberty blockers so that they can have what's considered a typical, quote unquote, puberty experience. It's baked right in there, this discrimination, that the same care that many young trans people need access to, there are folks who want to say, no, you can't have it, but these other folks can have it. These cisgender folks, the ones that are going to be the way we want them to be, can have it.
That's incredibly ominous. And I think that paired with the bigotry is also a widespread ignorance. You were talking about like cisgender folks accessing without even thinking gender affirming care. As adults, you're struggling with menopause and you get hormones. You know, you don't think of it twice. You don't think of it as gender affirming care, but it is when you're getting the estrogen, when you're doing all those things.
Or if you're trying to conceive a child.
Exactly. Those are all things. But because there is such widespread ignorance and straight up disinformation, I don't know how anyone believes Trump when he goes and he says they go into school a boy and they come out with their penis chopped up. Like,
so ridiculous.
It would be funny if it weren't impacting the lives of real kiddos all over the country.
There's no way and no world where any of that makes sense.
We can't predict all the ins and outs of how things will go down, but in your understanding, if they're able to uphold Tennessee's ban, what impact might that have? What do you see being broader implications? Is there a possibility that this would impact trans adults as well? Is there a possibility that this could in some way impact other marginalized communities and access to healthcare? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there is, of course, a risk with this next Trump administration of more difficult federal bans ahead. I mean, you know, there's already the fear of this kind of federal abortion ban, and most Americans support access to abortion. So when I'm thinking about a potential push for banning gender affirming care, I mean, the other thing about this is that unfortunately, most Americans are ill-equipped to understand what gender affirming care is. What gives me strength in this moment is that there are so many people who are already strategizing and fighting. Our crew, Gender Liberation Movement, held a bathroom sit-in last week on Capitol Hill in a restroom right across the hall from Speaker Mike Johnson's office, because we know that this is an era of radical defiance and we have to acknowledge that. I know folks don't want to hear the resistance words anymore, but radical defiance is something that we have to do in the face of fascism, in the face of authoritarianism, in the face of ultranationalism. And we have to be willing to call it that, because that's what it is. I'm seeing so many moderates and liberals and centrists who think, well, if we just don't talk about it in such scary terms, then we'll be fine. No, baby, that's not how this works. You need to call it what it is so you can actually confront the threat full on. That's a thing. I know that today there was a die-in in the UK because trans people in the UK have been facing this for years and years and years in deeper ways. But young trans people did a die-in public space to say, hey, this is what y'all are signing us up for. So I'm down for the direct action, the civil disobedience while we can. People have to assess their risks. But I also know that our community has always found a way. I remember having to scour the internet for little tidbits to figure out where to go to get hormones and start my gender transition. I'm from Georgia. I was going to the University of Georgia at that time. I had to travel an hour and a half to Atlanta just to have an endocrinologist that was versed in supporting trans people in their transitions. We know how to figure it out. I mean, unfortunately, there were a lot of people who could only access hormones through the black market. And a lot of families are having to flee. We've been talking about how they become refugees in their own country.
I think that there is tremendous resilience, and people shouldn't have to fight so hard to survive. And both are true. And I think that it's similar in a way to the fight for abortion rights. And it's similar in many ways, but this being one of them. Yes, people can find a way, but fuck, they shouldn't have to. It should be on demand and without apology. Yes, we can and should do everything we can to help and fight for each other. And it shouldn't have to be so hard. And people shouldn't be criminalized and punished. And I think that that is just as true for gender affirming care, because we know not everyone can travel. Not everyone will have the ability, the resources, the know-how to find that black market access. I think that what you were saying about people fighting while they still can is so essential. And I wanted to get more of your experience. We ran a clip last week of the protests that you did, the sit-in. If you could just tell us a little bit more about the sit-in at Capitol Hill, basically what compelled you to do it, what stands out to you about this kind of determined, creative, bold, defiant action?
Well, I think just to back up and talk a little bit more about the collective gender liberation movement, which I helped to found this year, we've been interested in shifting the discourse around gender so that folks kind of understand that it touches all of our lives and that there are actually more connections than differences between our experiences. And so earlier this year, we had a gender liberation march, which brought together the fight for reproductive justice, access to abortion, and the fight for gender affirming care. So essentially building a coalition that can fight and double up efforts together for these issues that are targeting our bodily autonomy, because that's kind of what's at the heart of all of this. And so with this action in response to Representative Nancy Mace's crusade on keeping trans people from using the restrooms that reflect our truths, and also Speaker Mike Johnson's capitulation to that rule, particularly in regards to Sarah McBride, who was just elected as a first openly trans person to represent on that level of U.S. government. We wanted to do a civil disobedience that drew on this kind of rich history of the Greensboro sit-ins or the Woolsworth sit-ins. If you had a good textbook, then you saw images of these young Black folks at the counter demanding to have their humanity and dignity acknowledged. So confronting white supremacy head on. There's also a lesser known moment at Julius Bar in 1966 where gay folks went and demanded to be patrons at this bar in the face of threats that they would be criminalized. So told that they're conducting disorderly conduct or operating in illegal ways. And so that is how serious things are now. I think for me as a Black trans woman from the South, grew up with parents who had N on their birth certificates for Negro, grew up and come from people who experienced segregation and Jim Crow. I see this as completely connected to that. So the same way that my Black elders were told that they couldn't use a restroom or use a water fountain that a white person was using is similarly how I feel about being told as a trans woman who has been using women's restrooms for most of my life at this point, being denied access because of these lies that are being pushed by people like Nancy Mace.
Thanks so much for that breakdown. You know, I was so heartened and so inspired seeing the courage and the we're going to do this and fuck you. We're going to be here, and seeing how unhinged Mace is in every encounter.
And cis people have to show up because there's cis people being attacked too because of this bigotry.
Yes, absolutely. Because how does any of this get enforced? Who decides? You know, it's extremely patriarchal. And for anybody who says they care about women's rights, they better be in this fight. They better be in this fight because they care about humanity and people, no matter what, not just about their own self-interest. But if you think that this doesn't affect cis women, you got to get your head out of your ass, because are you woman enough? Who decides what woman is? Oh, if I have some hair on my chin, what kind of policing of our body? It's disgusting. It's disgusting.
It's horrible. But we hope that it will spark more radical defiance, because that's what we need.
You had talked about, with Trump coming back to power, the possibility of, a national ban on gender affirming care. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on how you see the fight developing in the coming period on both sides, both the MAGA fascists, what you see them going for, and the kind of fight that we need from what we refer to on the show as the decent people, those who aren't fascists.
Yeah, I mean, we've already been seeing a ramp up in this anti-trans legislation over the last few years. And then, of course, we know Project 2025 lays out so many ideas on how to restrict people's access to care or even just monitor it. Trying to block transgender healthcare is tied to trying to monitor the reproductive healthcare of people who may need abortion access. So that's there. We already know that they want to get rid of mentions of LGBTQ plus experience on every level of the government, but also, of course, in schools, which is tied to the curricula bans against Black history and Native American history and so much more under the title of CRT, critical race theory, which is a misnomer. And then I think it's also about what are they going to try and criminalize. They want to roll back anti-discrimination protections. Is your employment status going to be more precarious under a second Trump administration? Maybe. I think we're also just getting signals from who is being positioned as leaders or nominees for the cabinet too. But also thinking about Elon Musk, who has been on a cultural crusade along with the J.K. Rowlings of the world against trans people specifically for the last few years. Musk has made it clear that he feels jilted by the fact that he has a trans daughter who is open and proud of who she is and has lied about this idea of being tricked into supporting her when she was a teenager. It's like, babes, I thought you were a genius. How could anyone trick you, the great Elon Musk, the great Oz, into supporting your trans child if you didn't really actually believe it? We know that that is coming, but we also know that our media ecosystem, particularly in the mainstream, has also not put up a robust resistance against this either. I mean, it is on a regular basis that we're seeing in the New York Times, for instance, the paper of record, so much of a imbalance in discussion around trans people's experiences, where they will prop up ignorant, bigoted talking points and anti-trans activists and not make it clear that those sources have a history of being anti-trans. I mean, essentially, the Alliance Defending Freedom, the Heritage Foundation, these organizations that have hokey sounding names, they're basically Westboro Baptist Church in a suit that isn't going to go outside and picket and yell like they did in the early 2000s, but they're going to show up and act like they have legitimate arguments for their hatred and bigotry. And I know what that's like. I mean, I came of age in the mid-2000s. I grew up in a very Catholic household. You know, I remember all of the discussions around the sanctity of marriage and all of this. We've got to protect this institution from the gay people. It's just rehashed ignorance. It's a net positive always when we support folks on the margins.
It was really helpful the way that you kind of broad stroked kind of the threat that we face with Trump's return and the ways in which they will fight. And then there's the way that the state fights, and then they're fucking shock troops and bigots on the street. And the culture of harassment and bigotry.
Which is the radicalizing. That's what the horrible media ecosystem radicalizes. And, we're talking about transphobia, but what is catcalling going to look like when we have someone found liable for sexual assault against E. Jean Carroll back in the White House? Or we see the Pete Hegseths of the world continue to gain power. It was scary before, but we didn't have these rulings basically co-signing that a lot of this harassment and abuse was true. Now we do. And what does that mean for our society?
So important to bring up. Given that, what should the fight on our side look like for this, I don't want to say resistance, for this culture?
They're just words that get popular and get unpopular. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. People don't want that word, whatever. But the culture of refusal. And on the one hand, we need that culture of defense. If trans people are under attack, there needs to be an immediate emergency response. But there also needs to be some kind of going on the offense and being like, we're not going to let you treat our people this way. We're not going to let you do this to our trans siblings. There needs to be, I feel like, both aspects. And I wanted to hear, what is your vision of what that should look like and how can we? And I will say, and Raquel might not say this, but you must be a part of this.
They should, yes. I think everyone has a role to play in this. But I thought that before we had full-throated fascism, even though we've always had elements of it. I think the first thing is recognizing that there is a problem. All of the discussion about democracy is dying, the empire is dying, it's decaying. Okay, you see that, but have you really felt that and reckoned with that? And so what does that mean? That means that there are a lot of institutions that you can't just accept have your best interests at heart. Now, that has always been the case for a lot of groups on the margins. On some level, many women have expected to not have their medical concerns really heard by a patriarchal medical system. Or trans people have had our gender experiences denied or needed a cosign from psychologists and psychiatrists to be considered valid. And it's like, I actually don't need you to tell me who I am, right? I just need you to help me get what I need to be the best version of myself. Or I think about Black folks who have also historically not been able to trust the medical industry writ large. It's about understanding that these institutions, especially now, are not necessarily on your side, seeing them for what they are. I think it's about fighting for the institutions that you believe in. So if they're not showing up, being outspoken, fighting and defending the folks that you care about in the ways that you think they should, you need to hold them accountable, because we need our institutions to offset those institutions that are failing us. And if that institution doesn't exist, then you've got to build it. But you can't really build an institution without community, without knowing the people around you, without that people power, because that is the source of all of the might of any institution, is the belief from a contingent of folks. So that part is important. I think people need to figure out safety and security for themselves, digital and physical. That's important. How are you going to defend yourself? That's important. Again, things that people on the margins have always had to think about. Women have always had to figure out ways to defend ourselves. So those things. And I think it's also educating yourself. Since we can't depend on a lot of media, that means finding those outlets that you do trust, like Refuse Fascism. There's this book called We Refuse that's all about Black resistance, reading more about the Black Panther Party, other leaders and thinkers that can fill the void left by a crumbling media ecosystem that mirrors a crumbling government. I'm just throwing it all at you. There's something in there for folks to start working on. I think finding a political home. I don't think the Democratic Party is really serving most folks on the margins right now. And political homes are not just political parties. Some of those grassroots efforts that show up for your community. It's messy. I need to get it neat and put out my little list.
I think the situation is messy. We're being called to do many things. And that doesn't mean that everybody does everything, but there is much to be done and we need to be doing it together, which means that no, you're not a lawyer. You're not going to be defending people. But you know what? My pops is. So there's going to be different ways that people come into this fight. But to think at all that you can tune this out, it is morally repulsive to think that. But it is also a strategy to fail because it's coming for you too. It's coming for us all. So even if somehow you can sleep at night because the target's not on your back yet, fascism comes for all of us. It even comes for the fascists themselves. So I think that that's just an important way to look at it. You did bring this up a couple times. And before we close, I want to make sure that I get your thoughts on this. You had brought up what I see as the Democratic Party's complacency or enabling of these fascists. And I think that they're not outright aiding and facilitating MAGA fascism. They are definitely accommodating and conciliating to it. And I think that that's especially true when we look at the assaults on abortion rights and on trans rights. Just this week, I don't know if it was yesterday, I'm losing track of time, but they signed off on the defense bill that, please correct me if I'm wrong, but it bans military families from using their health care that they receive to provide gender-affirming care to their children. Those medical plans won't cover that.
And I believe there were 81 Democrats that signed on for it, or approved it.
Yes, I just wanted to get your thoughts on it. There's been talk lately about it's framed that they lost because they supported trans rights, which I think is absolute bullshit, because if that's what support for trans rights looks like, I don't want to see what against trans rights is.
It's revisionism. They just needed a scapegoat. And you saw in the lead up to the election, in a way, from some people, this kind of trying on who the scapegoat would be. They tried to try on Black cisgender men as the scapegoat. Well, the numbers are too high to do that again, although they have tried to do that in previous elections. There was, the Latino vote, right? But I think that didn't stick. Or the Latinx vote. And see, they're going to say that's why the Democrats lost, because you're speaking with gender neutral language. But trans folks became convenient. We've always represented, for a lot of people, the going too far. Even people who are considered the left of the left when it comes to economics, for instance.
Absolutely.
Like, they will throw trans people under the bus. And there's this idea that, oh, well, y'all go too hard on the social issues. Just talk about economics. And it's like, people's lives are impacted. Actually, if we were going to have a real conversation, let's talk about the unemployment rates for trans people in a transphobic society. Let's talk about the lack of access to safe spaces for education and that impact on somebody's economic livelihood. We could be having those conversations, but the Democrats have failed to ward off these anti-trans attacks. And partly because of that is why it's lingering over everything right now, because the Republicans were like, oh, well, they're not going to touch this. It's too volatile for them to touch this. So we're going to throw out a $215 million campaign saying that she supports trans people. It's revision that trans people and the Democratic support for trans people is why they lost this election. It just simply is. Now, I do want to say in a more nuanced way, I hate the fact that they were able to go after young trans people and military families and their access to health care through this military spending bill. If we're talking about fighting fascism domestically, we have to be invested in fighting it internationally. And anyone who has been silent about the ongoing genocide in Gaza and the West Bank and displacement and settlements, and also what's been happening in Lebanon and the expansion of this war, now I guess you're a part of the problem. And when you don't hold your leaders accountable for those massive things, they can get away with a lot. They really can. There isn't enough discussion on the fact that part of the reason that they could get this bill approved is because of the military.
100%. I just thought it was like a good recent example of the Democrats.
You're right. And I wish there were more leading LGBTQ plus organizations that would be vocal against how the U.S. military wreaks havoc around this world. But unfortunately, many have gotten very far from the radical roots of the LGBTQ plus rights movement, which if the Stonewall riots was the seminal event, it was a queer militant uprising against the New York Police Department. So essentially against state violence. And people in our community have been anti-war for decades.
I could talk to you forever. I want to be respectful of your time. I also want to say there's been a lot of talk about this language of, I think you mentioned this earlier, about why do they keep going on about the bathrooms? If they could just talk less about this, we would have more seats at the table, and then we'd be able to make real change. At the seat of what table? At the seat of a table that's wood, is carved with oppression, and is a table of empire. And if you want a seat at that, I don't know what to tell you. You're not about getting free. It's a good game to talk, but it's not going to actually get you freedom. I just wanted to counterpose that again with what it is that you are calling for. And I wanted to close out with an opportunity for you to just share either if there's things that gender liberation movement is calling for, or that you personally think you just want to underscore, how people can connect with your work and the work of gender liberation movement. I just wanted to give you an opportunity to do so.
Folks can check out our work at genderlib.org. We're always down to donate. We are a volunteer grassroots org doing this work, and new. That's also a thing. When it comes to this next era, I really do want to uplift a project to support families that have to flee to other states for gender affirming care. And that's the Trans Youth Emergency Project through the Campaign for Southern Equality. So look up the Trans Youth Emergency Project. I believe it's tyep.org, but don't quote me. And I would say if you care about talking about gender in nuanced ways and the trans community and want to figure out how to get involved outside of going to those websites, follow all types of trans voices. We have a problem in our community too, where often the folks who have a lot of access to political power or who are listened to by the political establishment tend to be very privileged, tend to be very white, tend to not be connected to folks on the ground in a real way. And I'm always interested in shaking all that bullshit up.
Thank you again, Raquel, for sharing your experience, your insight, your perspective, and your badass work that you're doing. I'm so glad we got to connect.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Next, I'm sharing an interview with semi-anonymous, Philadelphia-based street artist Yomi to discuss art, fascism, and resistance. Welcome, Yomi. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
I think where I want to start is how, as a political street artist, how you see the moment that we're in right now. What do you see in terms of what needs to be spoken to, or what is driving your art in this moment, or what is crying out for some attention?
First things first, what needs to be spoken to, what's driving things, what's driving the art, what's attention needs to be grabbed. I feel like attention needs to be grabbed of everyone, every single person. Attention needs to be en masse, because if you remember, a lot of momentum was built during the first administration, during the first Trump term. That momentum, in my opinion, should have never stopped. Instead, what we saw with the arrival of Joe Biden, everybody put away their signs, everybody put away their rage, everybody put away their frustrations, and we're off once again to La La Land. To me, these things are very concerning because it just shows how content the general populace is with the status quo. That just allows people like, demagogues like Trump to arrive on the stage and fill up this vacuum, this void. As far as art goes, to me, it's a vehicle to deliver a power punch, to deliver a counter punch to what has been thrown at us. And especially in times like this, when fascism is in your face, and when you have outright fascist government that peddles populist ideologies, that needs to be definitely countered without any hesitation. And to me, political art is a spear that leads the charge in that term, because it can be used to counter this vile aggression, which is screaming on the other end, as you know. Because art, as you know, can be used as a very versatile propaganda tool. And it has been used throughout history as a propaganda tool. To give you an example for that, which is misunderstood here in the West, was the war in Bosnia from 92 to 95. This particular conflict was completely misappropriated or misunderstood by Western journalists and powers. And they peddled it as some form of, thousands of years old ethnicity or ethnic issues, which was not the case. As we well know, the Bosnian War was completely a war that was born out of successful propaganda. And that was its perfect illustration of a visual battleground between far-right Croatian and Serbian propagandists who had absolutely vile and disgusting messages of ethnically pure states, and on the other side, everyday people that were trying to scream messages off the walls of hope, unity, and inclusion.
Thanks for that example. I think that helps provide a little bit more texture of what you're talking about in terms of propaganda. I mean, when you think of your street art, you talked about being that counterpunch. There's no pulling any punches in your art. It's very direct and very forward. And the political message isn't hidden or it's not an innuendo. It's right up front and central. While it's still art, it's still artistic. For listeners who aren't in Philly who may not have seen your art, which has been ubiquitous now for some time, these are messages like, Dear America, cultures that can't distinguish reality from illusion die. There's nothing hidden. Dear America, it's easy to destroy. It's much harder to build. These are direct messages. Dear America, people who shut their eyes to reality invite their own destruction. This was part of your whole Dear America series. And I think on this show, we talk a lot about American fascism and the American roots of that, and what you kind of continue to come back to, I feel like, in that series is trying to get people to look as a nation in the mirror at what is America, and also challenge people to really engage with, are we going to live in a fantasy or are we going to live in reality? And so I wanted to just give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about that series in particular and kind of how you developed that style of being very direct, but also undeniably art.
The development of that is via what for years and years and years have been observation of what took place in Eastern Europe when I used to live there, and with the collapse of the communist regime in the late 90s. When we're talking about these ideologies, and then we're talking about the rise, populism, the rise of far right, the Eastern European artists definitely have been sounding the alarm for decades, talking about how fascism should be countered, should we never left a moment of breathing. It should be countered immediately, because once left run amok, what takes form and what becomes out of it. The time has come for no longer to be woke or awake or aware. It's time for action. And that is the prime message of the Dear America series, is to inspire direct action, is to inspire people to start engaging. Because without engagement, you're not a participant in what we would call a democratic society. You know what I mean? It becomes non-existent. You become a spectator. Once you become a spectator, it's tick-tock from there. The time is ticking. That is the main premise, is to become an active participant. And active in the community, active in your cities, active in your states, because that's where it begins, that's where it starts. And especially with the way things are headed, I feel we need to be holding tightly together and support the community, deliver twice as much support, inclusion for everyone, for people of color, for people of the LGBTQ community, the gay community, people that are vulnerable and have no means of defending themselves against policies that are now literally are going to be unleashed to the fullest. And it's going to deliver a lot of damage. And a lot of people will be hurt, and the country in general will experience a very, very dark time. That's undeniable. That is the main focus on this particular series. It came from observation of what took place, from a lot of reading and literature and just thoughts over the years, observing American politics and American culture, and just literally, as you put it, writing it directly onto the walls.
It seems in stark contrast with your approach that all too many artists, especially American artists, if they have anything meaningful to say, they avoid this direct messaging, afraid to be too quote unquote political. And I was wondering, why do you think that is? And how can, at this urgent hour, how do you think we begin to challenge that or transform that culture?
I think transformation of that will happen via experience. And I think what you're saying, why a lot of artists here are talented, yes, but they refuse to be direct. You're speaking about almost like a fear of saying too much. I think that is because of inexperience of life processes that have taken place, let's say, in other parts of the world. For example, South and Central America, you see what goes on. You see what goes on in Middle East. You see what goes on in Eastern Europe. You see what goes on in Russia, and so on. When you experience such tumultuous and horrifying times, you literally have nothing to lose. And you become far more outspoken, far more fearless, because you realize that if you're not, you're going to get squashed. And whatever rights you think you have, they'll be completely gone. I think people here haven't realized that yet to the full potential. You see things fluctuate from administration to administration. Things get taken away, then some other crumbs have been thrown in the next one, and people are like, oh, look at this. Finally, this happened or that happened. These small bits of pieces, you know what I mean, that kind of keeping the masses at bay and content. But this, I feel, is finally coming to an end, and it's going to change dramatically starting January. Once the Trump administration takes their second term and begin dismantling things, I greatly believe things are going to change dramatically right then. Hopefully, that will encourage people to become more direct, to start actively participating and not just sitting on the sidelines. They will be more outspoken, I hope, and they will be less fearless, because that's what they're counting on. They're counting on fear, and they will do anything and everything to keep people down and to keep them afraid. It's very important to remain vigilant, to remain calm, and to not give in to such tactics.
No, I think that's a really good reminder. I think that we see it with visual art. We also see it with writing and stuff like that, where there's self-censoring that happens even before there's overt repression of an art. Obviously, your type of art is always repressed, but whatever's deemed legitimate, people want a gallery show or whatever, it's not forbidden yet, but people will stop making that art. People will stop taking that stand.
And they're trying to do it already.
Exactly. We saw it with what happened or didn't happen with people speaking out regarding the genocide in Gaza. As one example.
That's actually a very good example, because look at on one end, look at Gaza, and look at on the other end, Ukraine.
Exactly. But one was you were not allowed to speak out about it. And therefore, even though it wasn't codified, people they were like, oh, well, I don't want that to happen to me. I don't want to be the only one speaking out on this. Oh, those artists faced consequences. I don't want to face consequences. And I think one of the things that, because you're a street artist and you've always done things that are rebellious and out of the mainstream, this isn't true for you, but I think it is true overall in the art community, where it's like people don't want the consequences and people don't want the sacrifice. And I think that I'm not saying people should go and be reckless and take unnecessary sacrifice, but I do think that we have to be honest that if we're actually going to fight this the way it needs to be fought, and I'm not talking about violence, but like political struggle, if we're going to actually resist this, we're going to have to put something on the line, because either way, there's going to be loss, there's going to be risk, there's going to be sacrifice. And so wouldn't it be much better if it was on the terms of fighting for a future free of American fascism, instead of just the risk of being a gay person, or the risk of being a migrant in America, or the risk of being an activist standing for the people of Gaza, that kind of thing. So I don't know how we shift that culture.
You're talking about loss of culture if you don't do it. If people refuse to sacrifice, you're talking about a culture that's going to go on a fire. It's going to be lit. Absolutely and completely. And you're already seeing that happening with the school administration boards, with, in fact, the planning of dismantling the education board because they don't want educated people. They don't want people that can think for themselves and people that could actually get some ideas against and figure out what these guys are doing. Once the masses become educated to a point that they counter what is happening on the other hand, it becomes dangerous. You don't want that. Again, we're talking about maintenance of control. We're talking about suppression via fear tactic and maintenance by exerting control over the populace. And as you know, one of the first things to go is education in the arts, because these are the forms that scream expression, rebellion, freedom. You take these away, it's only a matter of time before everything else goes.
That was actually what I was going to ask you next. I mean, was how you see fascism threatening artists and art, and whether there were any examples that you wanted to share of.
Any examples, I'll tell you from my personal example, like my personal experience when I was a teenager, when I was 12. So I've been doing political graffiti since then. However, I wasn't allowed to write because I was too young, and because in my country, political graffiti was the only type at the time of graffiti. There was nothing else. And everything was against the government, against the state and police and you name it. And it was dangerous to do that because people that do that, should they get caught, they disappear. They get locked up or sent to work colonies, which we have in the northern part of the country. And it's just old prisons over there from Soviet times, which have been divided to kind of half and half, which hosts regular, let's say, criminals versus political criminals. And that's where they were going. You know, like a lot of the people that I used to run with and carry the buckets of pain for them at some point vanished and disappeared. And they got sent off to these work colonies, you know, to never be seen. Who knows how many years they kept them. But this is the result of being outspoken, of resisting these ideologies. They will do anything and everything to silence because this is dangerous to them.
And you feel like that is something that's possible in this country with Trump?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it very well could happen should what's coming right now becomes the norm. You know what I mean? It is inevitable until counter-resistance happens. And it will, because there's only so much you can do and so far you can push people. Once there's no more space that people can be pushed, or counter-resistance begins. And I think it's going to...
I really, really hope. To me, it's like so silent. He goes out and says, we're going to do the biggest mass deportations ever. And here's my whole plan to do it. And you don't hear anything.
Absolutely. And people thinking like, you know, and all this. And I'm like, when he says stuff like, I take these things seriously. I don't think they're joking. People here think they still view him as a clown, which of course he is. But once clowns start surrounding themselves with other people that actually can enact these policies, you know, in real life, it becomes not only serious, it becomes very, very dangerous. And it's going to have huge repercussions for, I think, not only decades, but quite possibly for generations.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I'm wondering, you know, with Trump's returning to office in a few weeks, you talked about things changing immediately in January. I'm wondering, like, what do you think it means to be an anti-fascist artist? Like, what is the art that needs to happen now? What is the role of an artist that doesn't want to be aligned with fascists? What are people called on?
Yeah, I think we have to do the quite opposite of what they're going to project, which on their end is going to be divisiveness, hatred, bigotry, sexism, you name it. I think the anti-fascist artists should project the quite opposite of that. Call them out on their shit by using humor, projecting more inclusiveness, more love versus hate, and just continuation of speaking the truth without any apology. I think would be a very effective counter. People have been doing that for quite a while, and it has worked throughout history, because that gives a rise to massive movements that eventually topple these regimes.
Yeah, I think that there has to be this dynamism between this art that provokes, that cuts, that challenges in a way that just regular agitation can't, and then powerful mass opposition in the streets. I think that there's that dynamism. I know that you've created art that's been used in mass actions, and I think that other artists should take that note and join in that. And I also think that those that are organizing actions, and whether it be putting their bodies on the line to stop, let's say, ICE Border Patrol from taking people away, it would be very powerful for art to be incorporated into that.
From our personal experience with you guys, you know what I mean? Like throughout the years, from the banner years that we used to do and all that stuff, and it just evolved from there. Like we used to like stuff for the Women's March, for Standing Rock, you name it, bunch of other organizations, and that rolls up. I feel, yeah, you're right. I think a lot more people, a lot more artists should get involved on that and continue to spread these messages and continue to spread this counteraction, because we need this nation to arise en masse, not just one city or one state, or half the country is doodling while the other one is pushing to try to make things better for everybody. It's not going to happen like that. You need a mass opposition to these toxic ideologies.
I want to thank you, Yomi, for taking the time to chat with me, to share your insights, your expertise, your perspective, and of course, your time. If people want to see your work, connect with your work, where do you want to direct people to go to? Your Instagram or what?
You can see obviously on the street. That's the quickest way, you can see on the street. Or for people that are, let's say, from other countries or out of state and all that, the fastest way is definitely Instagram, for sure. That's where a lot of people share. I rarely take photos, so a lot of people that take photos, they send them to me and I share them.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Yomi.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Refuse Fascism. Connect with us on the socials at Refuse Fascism. Yes, we are on Blue Sky. If you want to reach me, you can do so on Twitter X at Sam B. Goldman, on TikTok at Sam Goldman RF, or you can drop me a line at Samantha Goldman at refusefascism.org. Want to support the show? Amazing! We are so grateful. Support the show by getting a t-shirt, sweatshirt, or hoodie, which also spreads the imperative we've refused to accept a fascist America. See the show notes to get yours. Become a patron to support our pod and content creation to help people understand and act to stop the fascist threat. Visit patreon.com/refusefascism. Or if you can't give monthly but want to support, please make an end-of-the-year gift today. You can make a donation via Venmo, Refuse-Fascism, Cash App, Refuse Fascism, or by visiting refusefascism.org and hitting the donate button. And if you can't give now, we understand it. You can still be part of growing this audience and supporting the show. You can share the show with others through your listening app. You can rate and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, or comment on our socials or YouTube channel. It makes a difference and is so appreciated. And of course, follow, subscribe, so you never miss an episode. As always, thanks to Richie Marini, Lena Thorne, and Mark Tinkelman for helping produce this episode. Thanks to incredible volunteers, we have transcripts available for each show. So be sure to visit refusefascism.org and sign up to get them in your inbox. Until next Sunday, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America.